The Tonight Show, NBC Studios, Burbank, June 1973. The studio audience was already seated, and the warm-up comedian had already done his thing when Dolly Parton arrived at the studio, and by the time she came through the main guest entrance at 4:15, the place was humming with the specific pre-show energy that belonged to evenings when the guest list was particularly good. She was 27 years old and in the middle of something that the country music world was still figuring out how to categorize. Jolene had come out 5 months earlier, and the response to it had been the kind of response that doesn't just chart, it changes the conversation around a person. She had been on television enough to know how it worked, had been working in Nashville since she was a child essentially, had the specific ease of someone who had been performing since before most of the production staff in this building had started their careers. She came in wearing something sequined and bright and carrying the specific quality of warmth that was entirely genuine and not in any way manufactured, the warmth of someone who was genuinely delighted to be in whatever room she was in and communicated this clearly without any effort. She was the confirmed guest for the evening. Featured segment, the full conversation. She had prepared for the show she thought she was doing. She was not prepared for the second guest. Bruce Lee arriving as a surprise was by 1973 standard procedure. He had a condition that the production team understood and had learned to work with. No advance announcement, no pre-show promotion. He came out through the curtain as a surprise, or he didn't come at all. Enter the Dragon had been in theaters for 3 weeks. The world was in the early stages of understanding what it had on its hands with this particular person, and The Tonight Show had been working to get him back since his last appearance. He arrived at 5:20 through the side entrance. I was 23 years old and working as a production assistant on the show, which mostly meant carrying things for people who actually knew what they were doing and staying invisible. I had been doing this for 8 weeks. I was stationed on the right side of the studio, near the second camera position, close enough to the couch to see faces and occasionally catch things the boom mic didn't pick up cleanly. I watched the whole thing from about 10 feet away. What I'm about to tell you I've told to my wife and to my 2 sons and to approximately nobody else in 50 years. I'm telling it now because I'm 73 years old, and some things deserve to be said while the people who saw them still remember them accurately. Subscribe right now. Because what happens when Bruce Lee extends his hand on that couch is something the audience only half saw, and the half they missed is the half that explains everything that came after. Johnny's monologue went well. The kind of well where the room was warm by the second minute, and everything that followed was going to land into favorable conditions. He introduced Dolly. She came through the curtain, and the audience responded with the specific warmth that Dolly Parton produced in rooms, which was immediate and genuine and had something almost maternal in it. The response of people who have heard enough of someone's voice and enough of their story that they feel like they know them already and are genuinely glad to see them. She sat down with Johnny and the conversation started easily. She was good at this. Better than most, actually, because she had the quality of being completely herself on camera. No version of herself edited for television, just the actual person, which was rare, and which audiences sensed without being able to name it. Johnny asked about Jolene, about what she was working on next, about what it was like to be in the middle of what was clearly becoming a significant shift in her career. She gave real answers, specific and warm and funny, in the unforced way that people are funny, when humor is simply how they process the world. The audience was completely with her. 15 minutes in, Johnny looked at the camera with the particular expression I had learned to read in 8 weeks, the expression that meant he was about to change the temperature of the room. He said, "I have a surprise tonight. Someone who I think this audience is going to be very excited to see. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee." The curtain opened. The response was different from Dolly's response. Not less warm, different. The specific immediate full-room reaction that Bruce Lee produced when he walked into spaces in the summer of 1973, the sound of an audience that had spent 3 weeks watching and rewatching and talking about a film and was now watching the person from that film cross a stage toward them in actual physical reality. He walked to the desk and shook Johnny's hand. Then he turned toward the couch. He extended his hand to Dolly. She looked at it. Not for a long time. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But 2 seconds on live television, with a hand extended between 2 people, is a duration that has weight. She looked at it, and then she looked somewhere slightly past it, a redirect of her attention that was clean and complete, and left his hand in the air without a response for the full duration, before he lowered it. I was 10 feet away. I saw it clearly. Most of the audience didn't catch it exactly. The people in the front rows did. Johnny did, from behind the desk, his expression doing the thing where the surface stayed professional, while something behind his eyes was rapidly calculating. The crew members close to the couch saw it. For the broader studio audience, it registered as a small wrongness, the specific feeling of something not quite happening the way it was supposed to, without them being certain of what the something was. Bruce sat down. His face didn't change. Johnny said, "Well? Country music and kung fu on the same couch. I feel like this is a historic moment, and I'm not entirely sure how to honor it." The audience laughed. The laugh that releases the specific tension of a room that felt something awkward and is grateful for permission to move past it. Johnny looked at both of them. He said, "I want to start with the obvious, which is that you two represent things that don't obviously belong in the same conversation, and I think that's exactly why this is going to be interesting. Dolly, you've been making music since you were a child, essentially. Bruce, you've been training in martial arts for about the same length of time. What do those two things have in common?" Dolly went first. She said, "Well, I don't know that they have a lot in common, Johnny, but I'll tell you what I think they share, which is that you can't fake either one." "People know. They always know." Bruce said, "Yes, that's true." She looked at him. "You agree with that?" Bruce said, "The audience knows when something is real. They may not be able to say what they're responding to, but the response itself is the evidence." Dolly said, "Exactly. You can dress it up all kinds of ways, but real is real, and fake is fake, and people feel the difference even when they can't explain it." The conversation was warm and easy, and moving in a direction that was good television. And then Johnny asked the question. He said, "Bruce, your films have this quality of physicality that feels real in a way that's different from most action movies. Dolly, your music has a similar quality of emotional authenticity. Do you think those things are related?" Bruce said, "The technique serves the truth. In music, in martial arts, in anything. What audiences respond to isn't the technique itself, it's what the technique reveals." Dolly looked at him for a moment. She said, "That's a nice way to put it." She said it with a quality that was slightly different from the warmth she had been offering the conversation. Something slightly more measured in it. Bruce said, "You disagree." She said, "I didn't say that." Bruce said, "You didn't have to." The room went slightly quieter. Johnny leaned forward. He said, "Dolly, what do you think?" She said, carefully, "I think technique and truth are related, but they're not the same thing. And I think sometimes technique can get in the way of truth. When something is too polished, too practiced, too perfect, it stops being real, even if every single element of it is technically correct," she said. "I'm not saying that about you specifically." Bruce said, "What are you saying it about?" She looked at him. She said, "I'm saying that the most powerful things, in music, and probably in whatever you do, are the things that happen when the technique gets out of the way, when something just is what it is, without all the packaging." Bruce said, "What does that look like?" She said, "It looks like the way a person moves when they don't know anyone's watching, or the way they sing when they're not trying to sound like anything, when it's just them." Bruce said, "And what you saw when I walked in." The room went quieter still. She didn't answer immediately. Johnny said, "I think," Dolly said, "I saw someone who knew he was being watched." She said it simply, not unkindly but directly, and it landed in the studio with the specific weight of something true being said in a room full of people who could feel its truth. Bruce looked at her. He said, "You're right. Like this video right now. Because what happens next is the part nobody who was in the studio that evening expected. The room was very quiet, 400 people and a full production staff in the specific quiet of a room that has just watched something real happen and isn't sure what to do with it yet." Johnny had his hands flat on the desk. He was watching Bruce, with the expression of someone who has hosted 3,000 hours of live television and is currently watching something he cannot account for in his experience. Bruce said, "When I walk into a room like this one, I am always aware of being watched. That awareness doesn't leave because I've trained for 20 years. It's there. What the training produces is not the elimination of that awareness. It's the ability to be aware of it and still be present." He said, "You said you saw someone who knew he was being watched. That's accurate. What you may not have seen is that knowing I'm being watched and allowing that to change what I am are different things." Dolly looked at him. She said, "Are they though?" Bruce said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean the moment you know you're being watched and you're thinking about the knowing, some part of what you do is already a performance. Even if it's a very good one, even if you can't feel it yourself." Bruce said, "And you've figured out how to not think about the knowing." She said, "I've figured out how to think about something else instead, something that matters more than being watched." Bruce said, "What do you think about?" She said, "The song, the person I'm singing to, the thing I'm trying to say. She said, when I'm thinking about that, the being watched part doesn't disappear, but it gets smaller. It stops being the main thing. Bruce said, that's the same principle. She said, is it? He said, the principle is that the thing you give your attention to is the thing that grows. If your attention goes to the being watched, the performance expands. If it goes to the technique expands. If it goes to what you're actually trying to do, that expands. The training is supposed to put the technique in the background, so your attention can be on the thing that matters. She was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet with her. She said, then why didn't you shake my hand that way? The studio went completely still. Johnny said, Dolly said, no, I want to ask this. You extended your hand when you sat down, and it was a completely correct gesture. It was the exactly right thing to do in the situation. But it felt like a gesture rather than a greeting, and I didn't want to respond to a gesture. She said, I know that was rude. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do. I'm saying it's what happened, and I'm trying to explain why. She said, and now I want to know if what I saw was what was actually there, or if I read something wrong. The room was waiting. Bruce said, you didn't read it wrong. She looked at him. He said, I came out through that curtain knowing the audience was going to react a certain way, and I did what I do when audiences react a certain way, which is manage the space, walk with intention, give people what they came for, and the hand I extended to you was part of that management. He said it was a correct gesture. It wasn't a greeting. Dolly said, yes. She said it simply, just the acknowledgement. Bruce said, and you responded to what was actually there, rather than what it was supposed to represent. She said, I didn't mean it as an insult. He said, I know. She said, how do you know? He said, because an insult has a direction. What you didn't have a direction. It was just honest. She said, real is more interesting than polite. He said, yes. She said, I've always thought so. The room, which had been quiet in the specific tense way of a room that doesn't know what it's watching, changed quality. It became a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when a room understands that something genuine is happening and wants to stay inside it. Johnny, from behind the desk, had the expression of someone watching a conversation take a shape he couldn't have predicted and finding that the shape was better than anything he would have predicted. He said quietly, can I ask something? Both of them looked at him. He said, Dolly, when you said you saw someone who knew he was being watched, was that a criticism or an observation? She said, observation. He said, and Bruce, when you agreed with it, was that a concession or a clarification? Bruce said, both. Johnny said, I've been doing this show for 11 years. I want to tell this audience that what's happening on this couch right now is not a thing I can manufacture. The booking I can do, the guests I can arrange, whatever this is theirs. The audience responded. The specific warm, sustained response of people who have been given something they weren't expecting and are expressing genuine gratitude for it. The commercial break came about 12 minutes in. Fred de Cordova, the producer, was on the floor before the transition finished. He came to the couch with the measured urgency of someone who has managed live television for decades and knows how to communicate urgency without alarm. He said something to Johnny. He said something to Dolly. He turned to Bruce. I was close enough to hear Bruce say, the conversation is real. That's what the show is supposed to be. Fred said, I understand that. I'm asking you to keep it in a register I can put back on air. Bruce said, what register is it in now? Fred said, an honest one. Which is fine. I just want to make sure it stays safe. Bruce said, safe. Fred said, comfortable. For the audience. Bruce said, the audience isn't uncomfortable. Fred looked at 400 people who were all leaning forward and said nothing. He went back to the production area. The light came back on. Johnny said, we were talking before the break about something that I think is genuinely interesting, which is the difference between performing something and being something. Dolly, you made a distinction earlier about technique, getting in the way of truth. I want to stay there because I think there's more. Dolly said, well, I'll tell you what I meant by it because I don't want it to sound like I was criticizing anybody's technique. Because Bruce's technique, from what I've seen in the pictures, is extraordinary. Bruce said, but. She said, but technique is a tool. And like any tool, the best version of using it is when you're not thinking about the tool. When it's just part of how you move. She said, the most powerful moments in music are the ones where you forget you know how to sing, where it's just coming out of you because something is true and it has to. Bruce said, And you think I haven't found that. She said, I think you've found it in what you actually do, what you train. I think when you're in that, you're completely real. She paused. I think the version of you that walks through a curtain on a television show is a different version. Bruce said, You're right. She said, I didn't expect you to agree so easily. He said, Why would I disagree with something accurate? She said, Most people protect the version of themselves they show in public. He said, Most people build their public version carefully enough that the protection feels necessary. She said, And you haven't. He said, I've built one. I just don't confuse it with the real thing. She said, What's the real thing? He said, Someone who started training when he was 13 because the training was the most honest thing he could find to do with his time. Someone who's been trying to figure out what's actually true about how human beings move and fight and respond to each other under pressure for 20 years. That's the real thing, he said. The curtain entrance is the packaging, she said, and the packaging was what I saw. He said, Yes, she said, and the packaging is what you extended your hand with. He said, Yes, she said, so in a way, when I didn't take it, I was asking for something more. He said, Yes, she said, and you knew that. He said, Not immediately, but yes. She looked at him, the specific quality of looking that people have when they've received something that lands accurately and are sitting with the accuracy of it. She said, I've been in this business since I was a child. I can spot performance at 100 yards. I do it automatically. It's how I've survived in rooms that weren't built for people like me. She said, When you walked out, I clocked the performance immediately, and I didn't want to be part of it. Bruce said, That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a professional setting in a long time. She said, I'm from Tennessee. We don't do subtle. The audience laughed. Real laughter. The warm, genuine kind. Johnny said, I want to stay on something Bruce said. You said the training is the honest thing. What does that mean? Bruce said, It means when I'm working, actually working, drilling the techniques, testing them against real resistance, finding out what works and what doesn't, there's no performance available. The technique either works or it doesn't. The body either responds correctly or it reveals what it hasn't learned yet. There's nowhere to hide in that. He said, That's the honest thing, the thing where there's nowhere to hide. Dolly said, That's what writing a song is. He said, Yes. She said, You can't fake the thing that makes it work. You can fake everything around it, but the actual thing, the reason the song has to exist, you either have that or you don't. He said, What's the reason Jolene had to exist? She was quiet for a moment. She said, Because I needed to say something I didn't know how to say any other way. About being afraid of losing something, about the specific way that fear looks when it's directed at a real person. She said, That part you can't fake. He said, No. She said, And the part you can't fake is the part that reaches people. He said, The audience always knows. She said, They always know. The studio was very quiet in the specific way it had been quiet for most of the last 15 minutes, the quiet of people who are listening to something they don't want to interrupt. Johnny said, I've been doing this show for 11 years, and I want to say something for the record. He looked at both of them. He said, When I put two guests on this couch who have nothing obviously in common, the hope is that the conversation finds something. Usually, what it finds is polite professional territory, common ground that's comfortable and entertaining and forgettable. He said, This found something else, and I'm not going to try to name it because I don't think I have the right word, but everyone in this room felt it. The audience responded with the warmth of people confirming something they had all been feeling separately and were glad to have named collectively. Near the end of the segment, when Johnny was beginning the transition toward close, Dolly looked at Bruce and said, I owe you something. He said, What? She said, When you sat down and extended your hand and I didn't take it, that was rude. He said, It was honest. She said, Those aren't mutually exclusive. He said, No. She said, I could have taken your hand and asked the question. I didn't have to choose between them. He said, The choice you made produced this conversation. She said, The choice I made was rude, and it produced this conversation. Both things are true, he said. Yes. She said, I'm saying I'm sorry for the rude part. He said, I know. She said, You're very easy to apologize to. He said, People always say that. I think it's because I don't need the apology to be larger than it is. She said, What does that mean? He said, An apology is just an acknowledgement that something happened. Most people make it into more than that. A performance of the apology. I just need the acknowledgement. She said, You've already got it. He said, Then we're done. She reached her hand across the space between them. He took it. The audience responded the way they respond when something has resolved that needed resolving, and the resolution came in exactly the right way, which is warmly and completely, and with genuine feeling underneath the sound. Johnny looked into camera one. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I genuinely do not have the language for this evening yet. I'll figure it out later. What I can tell you right now is that what happened on this couch tonight was the realest thing that's happened on this stage in as long as I can remember." He said, "Thank you both." The show went to credits. Most of the audience stayed in their seats afterward, in the specific reluctance of people who have been somewhere worth being and aren't ready to give it up by walking out. I stood at my camera position and watched them. Dolly was talking to the segment producer, warm and professional, the same version of herself she'd been when she walked in, except something underneath was different, in the way that things are different when something real has happened to a person in public. Bruce sat on the couch for a moment doing nothing, just sitting with the quality of stillness he had, which was never the stillness of someone waiting for something, but always the stillness of someone who was completely where they were. Then he stood and picked up his jacket and walked toward the side exit. He passed close enough to my position that I could have said something. I didn't. I didn't have anything to say that would have been worth interrupting whatever he was carrying with him from that conversation. He walked out. What I've thought about most in 50 years is the moment he agreed with her. When she said I saw someone who knew he was being watched, and he said you didn't read it wrong. That moment. The complete absence of defense in it. The specific quality of a person who has been practicing honesty for so long that agreeing with an accurate observation costs them nothing, produces nothing in them that needs to be managed. Most people would have deflected, would have explained, would have found a way to make the observation less true than she had made it. He just said you didn't read it wrong, and then explained why she was right and what it meant. And then the conversation went somewhere that neither of them had planned for, and that was better than anything planned. He knew what the evening needed. He let it get there. He didn't fight the honesty of what she'd seen. He offered his own honesty back. That's the part that doesn't fit in a headline. That's the part that took me 50 years to understand clearly enough to describe. Some things stay with you because they were dramatic. Some things stay with you because they were true. That night was both. But the true part was the part that lasted. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. Tell me in the comments what you think Dolly was actually thinking in those 2 seconds while she looked at his hand. I read every one.